high of 44. Friday, sunshine and 49. And Friday night, a chance of rain. Saturday, also a chance of rain. Partial sunshine with a high of 50.
ON AM and FM. Welcome to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.
Did Mothman really predict the deadly collapse of a bridge over the Ohio River in 1967? Is he, she, or it predicting nuclear war now? What is prophecy?
Hello and welcome to the 1023rd, I can't believe that, Ben, edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno, coming to you from WOON AM and FM in Woonsocket, Rhode Island. And it's on the Paranormal Radio app, TalkStream Live, and on YouTube. And that, of course, was Ben Eno. I'm Mark D'Antonio, here to help things along. So welcome to everybody.
And also co-hosting with us today is Valerie LaFaso. So hi, Valerie. Thanks for stopping by and helping us out.
Hi, Ben. Hi, Mark. I'm so glad to be here, as always. Love being here on this show.
Well, we try to create a fun-loving atmosphere where we can delve into the deeper questions. And initially, we were going to have Nick Redfern on with us, but he could not be here today. And my father is sitting this one out today because he has other obligations. So it's just the three of us here. So the question of how many Enos does it take to do a show is going to be one today, which coincidentally, Eno is one spelled backwards. So we were going to be talking about Nick Redfern's latest research into Mothman events, because apparently he's cropping up again. But that's unfortunately not going to be happening, which I was very excited for. I didn't get a chance to read any of the new material, so because I'm a big, I don't know if this is a word, a Mothman head, but but I do so enjoy a good Mothman. And I guess what I can kind of do is give a little spiel about Mothman. We can kind of dive into some different implications of it, because it's a lot more intricate than just a weird-looking owl type thing. Some people think it's an owl, some people think it isn't. But essentially, the whole case started, excuse me, in it's over the Ohio River, but it was in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, in the late '60s, and it initially started with a group of teenagers. They were out one night just hanging out, and they saw this weird figure on the side of the road, and it looked almost like a man with these wings that almost looked like some described it as a butterfly, or like they had like moth-like wings, right? So they thought that was kind of weird, and they saw it stuck to a barbed wire fence, and so they thought nothing. They thought it was kind of weird, and they started driving a little faster. But then they heard something on top of their car, and it was following them, and it was flying along with the car, keeping speed with it. So they're speeding back to their homes. They try to make their way to the police department, and along the way, they kind of keep seeing it on tops of buildings. And they go to the cops, and they're like, "We saw this like weird sort of like bug guy, whatever." And they thought it was crazy. But then right after that, people started seeing more and more of this. And not only that, one of the really interesting things, which the late Susan Shepard told us when my dad and I went down. I was like 9 or 10 years old. We went to the Point Pleasant, West Virginia. We didn't go to the Mothman conference. We went to a paranormal conference down there, which coincidentally is where we met Bud Hopkins. And we spoke with Susan Shepard down there, and she was she was a kid during all of this, and she told us when I was a kid you would hear like footsteps on your roof. You would see like eyes peering out from like under furniture through your windows, and they were always red. And there was a whole lot of other stuff going on. Anything from Men in Black to UFOs to poltergeist activity to increased psychic activity. Classic flap area type stuff. And it all kind of culminated with the collapse of the Ohio River Bridge that connected West Virginia to Ohio. And I believe that was on Christmas Eve as well. So it collapsed, and all the phenomena ceased. So there was this idea that Mothman, seeing Mothman was like a prophecy, right? Hence where you get the Richard Gere movie for the Mothman prophecies, which was based on John Keel and his research of Mothman. And it was super interesting because it almost coincides with the myth of the Thunderbird. which I don't know if either of you are familiar with that. It was in some Native American mythology, which essentially was this giant bird that would predict like doom and all sorts of interesting things like that. And there's even like theories that, Mothman was seen at Chernobyl, in some pictures you can kind of make out some sort of like figure of like the smoke over reactor 4. There's even been reports of Mothman being seen today around Chicago and all sorts of other things. So there's this idea that, Mothman predicts like, doom and such, and something awful will happen. And it always coincides with other phenomena happening at the same time. And there's all sorts of intricacies between it, because after that initial weird figure was seen, the description of it changed. It went from being, typical humanoid figure with wings to, sort of like shoulders with like a little hump over it that kind of that with just like these, red eyes sticking out almost from the chest. And, it still had the wings, but it would move silently, which was even more interesting. Where its wingspan would extend and it would just kind of move silently up and down, and in people who've had interactions with it, they'll come away with anything of terror, or they'll have I'm forgetting the guy's name, but we had a guest on years ago who had an interaction with Mothman, saw him, and he became like a math whiz and an artist. Went from like a D student to like a mathematician. So it's really fascinating stuff, and I think we've really only ever scratched the surface with it. With our book, Behind the Paranormal 2, Bigfoot, Mothman, and Monsters You've Never Heard Of, which you can get on Amazon. Because
it's a good book. I have a copy. So does Val. She said.
Yeah, me too.
And I had one of my buddies over last night, and he was like, "Oh, I have a couple of the Eno books," and I was like, "Oh yeah, which ones?" He's like, "Oh, I'm trying to collect them all." But I was really hoping Nick would be here, because I do kind of like the whole idea of Mothman, this sort of interdimensional creature, perhaps, that I have to say perhaps, because it could be anything, right? It could be this. For all intents and purposes, if you strip away some of the other accolades of it, you could say that it loosely fits the definition of angel, right? In a biblical sense, or it could fit the definition of an extraterrestrial, perhaps, or
the Reaper,
or the Grim Reaper. it could fit a lot of these molds, and I think it brings a broader question to the fore, which is, what is our modern mythos, right? How do we define these creatures? And we try our best to kind of come up with things, but we don't really have a united narrative of it, right? A lot of other cultures in the past, and even today, you still have like a united front for the unknown almost. It's like a buddy of mine from Southeast India, and he came here when he was like, I want to say he was like 5 or 6. And he kind of went back and forth. And I remember we became friends in like 7th grade, and we kind of got each other, and we've been friends ever since. And he was telling me, because we were discussing, I don't know how we got in the subject, but we were talking about Bigfoot. And he was like, yeah, I remember when I first learned about Bigfoot, he was like, I was just like, oh, it's a Haruman, which is like, an upright like ape like figure, kind of like a Yeti in Hindu mythology. And he was like, oh yeah, I thought everybody knew what those were when I was a kid. He was like, yeah, it's just something that was there. And I thought that was a really interesting answer, because it's like, we try so hard to push all these things away with our fun little materialist minds. Like, science will figure it out eventually. And we'll what's happening here isn't what's happening over there. But I thought that the mythological mindset, and we'll define mythology really fast, which is a story that we all participate in, versus something fake or false, right? It's like, oh, it's a narrative to. I remember one of my a close friend of mine and my wife's is a priest. He's a very smart guy, but he's very very into Aristotle. He's very into categorizing things. And I remember I was discussing with him the implications of like ancient mythology, and he was like, yeah, he's a smart guy. He has like a master's, and he's not an idiot. He studied in Rome for like 6 years. But he was like, yeah, they were just trying to figure out lightning. And I was like, that's it? That's all you got? And he was like, yeah, it's just, they were just trying to figure it out using logic. And, the best they had was mythology. And I was like, I don't know if that's it, man. Because I think what's important is having a story that we all participate in. I mean, we do, effectively, which is our research in the paranormal and trying to figure out a story that brings all this together. That's why we tell stories of Mothman and the lesson of it, of, doom is coming, right?
But Ben, I have to say, when you think about, participating in a story, how many stories do you have to hear from around the world that are similar before you decide maybe there's something to this, right? For example, I did a lecture years ago in Denver on halos around religious figures, okay? And I'm certainly no expert on religious matters, but I was curious why the halo was turning up in all kinds of disparate cultures that never communicated with each other. Yet there on their cave paintings, there in their artwork, there in Renaissance paintings, the deities all have halos around their heads. How is it that the Wandjina myth in Northern Australia, the Darwin region of Northern Australia, shows the creatures with big black eyes and halos around their heads? How is it that those show there when they never saw halos? They were never in communication with Western or Eastern cultures. Okay, yet in Eastern cultures, deities have halos around their heads from different time frames. In India, creatures have, drawings show creatures with halos around their heads. The Valcamonica aliens, okay, halos around their heads. Renaissance painters show them all with halos around their heads. The halo is the ubiquitous feature that keeps showing up. What's causing that? See, now that's a myth, the Wandjina myth down in Australia. We have the Valcamonica mythos, okay? In Italy, we have the Renaissance folks painting these halos, and they show up in many other cultures that never, Native American cultures. My mother was Native American in part. So they show up in Native American cultures too. Why was that being replicated if it wasn't observed? See, I think it was an observation that made it into their culture. And so, in other words, you talk about participating in a story that becomes a myth, right? And now you have people that are seeing their story from their culture's perspective, this one from this perspective. These two never talk to each other. So how come they have the same story as these folks in part, particularly the halo, right? I don't know, Val, if you have anything to add to that. I mean, I don't know if you've seen this.
I've not, and now you've had me very curious about that, because I mean, we see that with other things where cultures that have never communicated, as far as we know, have commonalities in their religious beliefs or their practices or their architecture style, or that sort of thing. So I find that very curious, and I love the question of how often do you have to hear about something before it becomes this thing that we believe in, or that we don't believe in, or that we fight over at the dinner table.
Exactly. No, let's go to that Australian thing again with the Wandjina. Okay, the myth goes that the Wandjina are rumored to have come from the sky, live under the water, and have full mastery of the water. Now, wait, we talk about unknown submerged objects today, where ships and possibly beings reside underwater, probably to hide from us, because, as I've always said, they go where we are not. And where we are not is in the deep ocean. And based on what I have, my understanding of how they may travel, this is a theory and something I've been talked about all over the country, I think they could be there and not have any ill effect on them because of the nature of the way they work. And it is interdimensional. How interesting, right? Now, the Wandjina myth goes on to say that these two boys in the Darwin region, the Kimberley region of Australia, actually, were torturing an owl. And the Wandjina, in retribution, wiped out their villages with a tsunami because of their mastery over the water. Now, could that just be a tsunami that made it and got legs and became a myth? Yeah. but the wands and the drawings are still in the caves. Those aren't myth. Okay, they're part of a mythical structure. And when you look at an owl, if you look at an owl, you can, if you squint, see a gray alien because they have the big eyes and they have that small face, right? That is what could be what's called a screen memory given to the people that are viewing this. So I'm really perplexed and fascinated by the Mothman and other things, other creatures rumored to exist. And so rather than just discount them as silly and stupid, right, which is just the arrogance of science, I'm a science guy. So if you're going to be arrogant about it, well, you're not going to get very far because you have to be open, right? And I think you probably both agree with that.
So we know that there's been Mothman-like sightings across the country. Do we know if there have been other countries around the world that have reported similar things? I feel like that's one thing I haven't heard.
That's a good question.
Ben, do you know anything about that?
He's contemplating.
It's such a good question. He's at
It
a
is.
loss for words.
I agree with you.
Sorry about that.
Hey.
I took a call from Susan Spooler, which, look at that, Susan. We got I can give you a spot right away. So she has a couple of books from Nick Redfern to offload, and she has them at her website, which is flagstaffdowsers.com, and you can buy the books there. Now I apologize. Being a producer is a handful of work sometimes.
I can see that.
So so if you can catch me up on what was being talked about, I apologize.
Well, I had posed the question that, we know that there are Mothman sightings from other parts of the country. I've heard of people in Maine having similar sightings, and I think Michigan and other areas in the U.S., but have we heard of Mothman sightings in other parts of the world?
Oh, actually, I sort of. It's more of like a hearsay type thing, which I brought up a little earlier, which was the Chernobyl incident in Ukraine.
Oh yeah.
There supposedly there was something seen in the smoke over reactor 4. That there was a figure that could be seen or whatever, but it's with any sort of tragedy like that, it's like you can kind of you can read into things a little too much, I think.
Yeah.
But it's I've that's the only thing I can think of off the top of my head, because the majority of it was any of the information really has kind of come from Point Pleasant, because that's kind of like where the I think maybe where the term was coined is probably why we don't really hear about it elsewhere. You know what I mean? It's like if you don't know what to call something, and you see something like that, what do you say about it? I think that kind of has a little bit to do with it. Because if you don't know what to call something, you're like, oh, well, I guess it's just one of those things. And, years down the line, somebody calls it, I don't know, chupacabra or whatever. And you're like, oh, that's what I saw. It could be one of those deals, too. Because it's still like a relatively new term, I'd say. I mean, it's only within the last, 60-ish years. And because of that, it's like, it's kind of hard to nail down, if you will, like, what's kind of going on with it. So I think that half the problem is the term for it. Because I've heard the term, like I said, the term Thunderbird as well, where, you see giant birds or whatever, and it's always like sometime, I don't know if they've ever been near cataclysmic events, but, giant bird sightings have happened. Even here in Rhode Island, we've had a few. It's, you could lump them in if you really wanted to, but it's, it's the terms that kind of come with it, right? It's like, the term upright canine cryptid. You're hearing a lot more about that now, and it's like, oh, what, a werewolf? And it's like, people hear the term and there's a lot of baggage with it, because it's
Right.
like, oh, what is this, like, teen wolf or something? Like, no, it's people try to come up with terms to see what they see, and because we don't really have anything to kind of compare it with, I think. Unless you're in the field, then we're like, we have an idea of what this is. Other than that, it's like, what do you call it,
But, you mentioned baggage with, like, say, the werewolf stories and things. I mean, that's unfortunately that comes with all kinds of things whether we're talking about UFOs, unknown submerged objects, USOs. And I think that, for instance, is why, and just sort of an aside, I think that's why they changed the term, the government did, from UFO, which connotes tinfoil hats and people that are silly, okay, they changed that to UAP. They rebranded it. And once they rebranded it, they could call it anything, they could do anything they want with it. And once it became an official term that the U.S. government uses, now we see that UAPs are taken seriously, whereas people with UFO sightings are still considered the tinfoil hat crowd, right? Yet they're the same exact thing. And the USO topic is now, unknown submerged objects are now taken seriously because they don't have the F in there. UFO. UFO has just been culturally branded to be silly. And so whenever they talk about a UFO conference on the news, you see the little green blow up aliens all the time. Right. And the news hosts go, well, there's a UFO conference happening in wherever. Okay. It's like, that's what they do. They laugh it off. But if it was a UAP conference, then it would be like, well, there's an unknown anomalous or unknown aerial phenomena conference occurring in Detroit today. And the scientists are going to talk about it in a very serious way. I mean, they treat it totally differently because they don't know how to treat it like something silly because the government branded it this way. So with the Mothman, maybe they need to brand it as something that they can, maybe an unknown entity or some kind of EBE or something. And again, if you go into the paranormal with it, paranormal also connotes silly. I'll give you an example. When MUFON decided to work with Congress and talk about UFOs or UAPs as it became, they were very specific. Congress was very specific. We don't want paranormal crap. Just UFO, just UAP stuff, okay? We don't want to hear about the paranormal stuff. But wait, today's paranormal could be tomorrow's science, right? So why did they shut it off, right? And of course, MUFON said, well, okay. I mean, if that's going to be the way for you to keep listening to us and, we can share data with you, then I guess we have to do that. And so they did. But they don't actively enforce their people from not talking about paranormal activities because they know that today's paranormal could be tomorrow's science. And so they're not going to dispute it, and they're not going to really fight it. But they're not going to talk about it when they go talk in front of Congress as they have.
Interesting to me that, Mothman just needs a new marketing agency.
Isn't that weird?
It shows you the malleableness of our society and what we will and will not accept, and just how wishy-washy we all kind of are sometimes with this stuff.
You're so right, Valerie. You're so right. And in this commercial society where it was Black Friday and it'd be Cyber Monday coming up. Wait a minute. That's tomorrow. Oh, boy, we better shop. Okay. Honestly, what's it going to be? Tire Tuesday? Everybody buys your tires. Yeah, they keep that commercial train rolling, right? And it comes down to who clicks the most, who links the most, who repeats it the most. And what products get sold on which shows and under which circumstances. And so good performances, good shows, good entertainment, and good data is sometimes way overshadowed by the commercial need. And so they put some cheesy thing on, okay, that requires you to laugh at the green blow-up aliens, all right? And that becomes the big money maker. So they continue to do that. So it's tough. We're fighting an uphill battle this way when it comes to this stuff. So when you hear about Mothman, it sounds silly. And people say a thing with red eyes and a cape. Woo-hoo, hey, a superhero. No, it's a phenomenon that's occurring. And if more than just 5 people are seeing it, then in one location, then I think it merits investigation, right? If people are seeing it all over the country, if there's rumors of seeing it in Chernobyl, if there's rumors of having seen it elsewhere, okay, it requires examination. I've been fighting the arrogance of science for decades, and I can tell you that science remains arrogant in some ways, but in many ways they're opening up. And having an open mind is extremely, extremely important. And I don't know, Ben, I don't know, Val. I just think that our open minds are probably a good thing to have right now.
And speaking of open minds, it's time for our break. And so you are listening to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. Well, minus Paul today, but with Mark D'Antonio and Valerie LaFaso, if I can speak correctly. And we'll be right back here on WOON AM and FM.
Christmas in New York. The Northern Rhode Island Council of the Arts is hosting a bus trip to New York City on Saturday, December 17th. We'll get you to New York, and the day is yours. See the sights, visit a museum, see a show, whatever you like. The day is yours. Tickets are $90, and the bus will leave from the St. Anne Arts and Cultural Center parking lot at 5:30 a.m. For more information or to reserve your seats, email nrica@nrica.org or call Sharon at 401-767-7432.
Local and live at 99.5 FM.
Welcome back to Behind the Paranormal with Ben Eno, Mark D'Antonio, and Valerie LaFaso. It takes a lot of people to fill in my dad's shoes, doesn't it? And
yes, it does.
We are coming to you live from WOON AM and FM here on the corner of Park Ave and Kennedy Street here in Rhode Island's brisk Blackstone River Valley. And we're talking about a few interesting things, which is, Mothman mythos and the implications of language and how that matters and how we perceive things. So really this show's kind of mutating into something I didn't expect. So yay. Good job, everybody. Round of applause for all of us. And that is interesting because language does really matter and how we perceive things. Because there's 4 ways, and I've talked about this before, and people have heard this before ad nauseum. It's very important, so I apologize. That there are 4 ways in which we organize reality as humans: art, language, music, and ritual. And those are the 4 ways that we kind of order reality around us. We use words to look at things and give it an order. There's a sign in front of me. I know the sign says, Navigate Credit Union Broadcast Studios, WOON AM and FM radio. I see, the board in front of me with the lights on it, so I can control its volumes, how it gets put out, etc. And these things are important because it's how we organize, how we understand the world around us. And when we talk about the word UFO, unidentified flying object, if you take it out of its UFO box, it's such a fascinating way to explain a phenomena. And then by switching it, I initially thought it was sort of like he who controls the language controls the world type thing, right? UAP. We're going to switch the definition of it. We're going to change the name, and then we change how people view it. I thought it was malicious at first, but maybe it's not quite malicious, or at least not intentionally, because in a way it does lend credence to it, as you said, Mark. Because it's okay now we can discuss it, in a learned setting, which I personally believe academia has pros and cons, and so I can take it or leave it personally because it can turn into a big echo chamber.
Yeah, well, you think about this, okay? You talk about art imitating life, right? We've heard about that. We've heard that phrase a lot, right? But life imitates art too, okay? Now, art imitating life is something where, you see that. But then, for instance, when The Matrix came out, okay, and the Wachowski brothers did The Matrix, okay? Great movie, an alternate reality. You live in a pod, you got a thing stuck in your head, and you're just power for the alien civilization of robotic and AI, okay, to survive. Well, you would not imagine how many new reports came in saying that the moon is a hologram. We live in a matrix. And people really believe this. So this is where now people are trying to make life imitate the art they saw, okay? And that's something that, you have to fight against because, it's easy because the movies are made so well to see this as a reality, okay? And when we saw E.T., E.T., phone home, right? We love E.T. Great, he was great. A little cute little thing with a long head, Elliot, right? Great stuff. But we when that movie came out, we thought that aliens are benevolent and kind, right? And oh, they just want to go home, the cute little things. Then Alien comes out, and now you have a brain-eating alien, and it just like chunk out your brain, okay? And then aliens became really dangerous. And then Prometheus comes out, and these engineers built the human race, and they're going to destroy the humans because it was a failed experiment. What? And humans are like, no way. So, you're looking at all these different things and how movies have created narratives and actually created language, as you mentioned, around a myth or a fictional concept. Now, I can tell you this, that we see that sometimes science fiction has become science fact, right? Okay. This thing right here, William Shatner would have loved this. Scotty, wait, let me call you Scotty. I want to see your face, right? I mean, he can call and do a FaceTime call. He couldn't do that with the communicator in Star Trek in the 60s. But boy, was the communicator a massive, engineering improvement in mentally for the audience to see. And it's possible that people seeing that said, hey, I wonder if we could actually do something like that, right? And the next thing you know, that happens. I worked, as you know, with the great legendary Douglas Trumbull. 2001: A Space Odyssey was a phenomenal movie. Blade Runner, right? Exactly. Close Encounters. Okay. Well, in 2001: A Space Odyssey, Cara Delea is holding a piece of glass and he's working it and he's doing stuff on it, writing on it, and watching and looking at different statuses for the discovery that they were on, the ship. Doug is credited with creating the iPad concept because that's exactly what he had envisioned. So now, obviously, this far in the game, he doesn't get that kind of credit. But he is credited with actually sparking the idea for the iPad. So movies do cause revolutions in industry and technology. Through the fiction comes the reality. And so I personally think that as humans, we cannot imagine something that's actually impossible to do. Okay? I don't think our brains are built that way. The brains are built out of the building blocks the universe provides. So I don't think there is a way for us to imagine something we're incapable of. I know that sounds strange. I mean, I imagine myself being able to touch my elbow to my mouth. Obviously there are those types of limitations, but mental, technological limitations, if you can imagine it, it can probably happen in some way down the line, right? And I know that seems like a digression, but it really isn't. We're talking about Mothman. And so is there a creature that evolved in the universe that made it here in ways we can't yet understand, but ways that I do talk about as a possibility, and it got here and it would look very different. But keep in mind that the signal that life is on this planet started rising in our atmosphere over 2 billion years ago. That's oxygen. If you're carbon-based, which the majority of life in the universe probably is made of, it's the fourth most abundant element in the universe, so it stands to reason life's made of carbon. It's the most flexible element in the entire periodic table. If that's the case, then we have creatures up to 2 billion light years away that might have seen the signal from this little tiny blue dot, right? And if that's the case, Ben, who knows what kind of creatures might have come here? They might not look like the Greys. The Greys might be just one kind. I think they're from, the Greys are probably from a planet that has a red dwarf star. Okay, because they're going to be tidally locked, have one face always facing their star, and as such, maybe they're from the dark side where they need big eyes to see better, or the sunset side where they need big eyes to see better. See, so honestly, I think there is some potential truth here, and Mothman might be a different type of creature that evolved somewhere else in the universe. It doesn't always have to be a gray alien, right? So that's just a thought. So it kind of lends credence, and that's why I don't dismiss it out of hand. I used to, but I don't do that anymore because I think it requires you, if you're really, really interested in the science, it requires you to remain open to other possibilities.
What do you think, Val? Any thoughts?
Well, first, I really appreciate hearing that from a scientist because my
we can be pretty
experience with
stuffed
a
short
lot of
sometimes.
science-minded people is that they just will not believe anything that isn't already widely accepted, and they're not open. And that does seem so counterintuitive and counterproductive to being a scientist. But I want to go back to art imitating life and life imitating art, because how do you know which came first? You know,
Exactly.
there's so many stories of people who think that they were encountering ghosts until they hear somebody tell an abduction story and they're like, wait a minute, no, that's exactly what happened to me, but I thought it was a ghost, because they didn't have any other context until this other story came about.
Actually,
So
excellent point.
It's so hard to track, you know, which came first, the chicken or the egg, in these cases. So that's what I was thinking about when you were talking about that. But you know,
And I like that very much, Val, and you're absolutely right. I mean to cut you off. I'll send it right back to you. But it's true what you say. Okay, the arrogance of science precludes some sometimes, not all of them. I know some very, very open-minded science people, okay? But it often precludes them from thinking clearly about possibilities, right? Oh, and incidentally, the chicken came first, just so you know. The egg was an evolved way for the, well, never mind. Okay.
it's a whole different show.
Sorry, I didn't mean to get it.
I'd like to think that the egg crashed down from space and, you know, it just happened to happen, you know?
Right?
Crawled up out of the ocean.
It was a mutation. It was a mutation followed by an adaptation. The egg was a mutation to the way birth was done by these particular creatures way back when, before we knew what they were. They weren't chickens, okay? And so that, and they were reptiles, and that became a way to protect the young while they're being birthed, and also protect them from the elements of a changing planet. The live births were not evolutionarily satisfactory for continuance.
Wow. Speaking of satisfactory evolution, are you two working on anything? Got anything that's coming down the pipeline? Tell us a little bit about, you know, what you're working on these days, where people can find out more about both of you. So, Val, you first.
Yeah, thank you. So I am mostly on Facebook. I'm currently working on a website, but that is slow going at the moment. So you can find me on Facebook under Valerie Lofaso, author and empathic medium. It has information about my books. I'm primarily working on fiction stuff right now. I have the 5th book in my Tangled Web series is in the works. And I'm also working on a choose your own adventure style story, kind of a standalone with the main characters from my series. I do have some historical fiction also in the planning process. And of course, I have contributed a chapter with my own UFO and alien encounter to your next book, Behind the Paranormal 3 Uneasy Skies. Which,
We're working on it.
Yeah, hopefully next year we'll see that.
Yeah, exactly.
So-
Hopefully, fingers crossed. What about you, Mark? What are you working on?
Well, I've got talks I'm doing. I've got a book out called The Populated Universe. It's on Amazon and so forth. A lot of people like it. It's actually a layman's view of the universe and how life started here and how come it's elsewhere. The premise is life in the universe is the rule, not the exception. So that book talks about that and takes people through a logical way to understand that. I've had 9-year-olds read this book and actually understand many of the concepts in there. Not everything. And adults love it as well, because it's written for everybody to enjoy. And I got a lot of my original artwork in there, whoop-de-doo, but I didn't find it anywhere else. So you can also, as an astronomer, you can find me at skytourlive.org. We're a 501c3 organization that promotes education in astronomical topics. And we have a remote observatory in the Arizona desert that we access on clear nights. We have a second one going in the Arizona desert. We have a third one out here in this area, and you can see the telescope for it right there. It's a little bit in the dark right there. But we actually do these beautiful, it's wonderful because, let me just highlight that. I can see it back there a little better, except for me. All right. So basically, it allows us to it allows us to see, if I could just see me, it allows us to sorry, it allows us to showcase the astronomical world to people and show them the night sky live. So they see these beautiful things in the night sky, and it's absolutely live. It's happening as they speak, and we take people through what they're seeing, and how wonderful it could be to enjoy education in the universe, even in the dark.
Cool. Well, speaking of education, I thought of this while we were kind of discussing, and I think this is probably end us out on the show. But I have a question to pose for both of you, which is, do either of you think, agree, disagree, that how we view reality is sort of the main hurdle for how we negotiate sort of the bridge between what we call, well, I guess unknown phenomena, right? If we're going to use terms like, paranormal, etc., if we want to just kick that right out the door, this sort of unknown phenomena and science, is it how is the experience of reality the big hurdle, like the subject object problem?
Well, I kind of get the question. It really, I think, comes down to how we perceive the passage of moments, one to the next. So time, right? We talk about the space-time continuum when we talk about space, and most people have no idea what the words space-time mean together, and so that's a whole education in itself to understand that actual context and what we mean when we say the fabric of space-time. Space is fabric? I thought there's nothing out there. You can say it's a vacuum, but it's not like there's nothing there in that vacuum, and that's the thing that makes people crazy, because if there was nothing there, then gravity wouldn't work out in deep space. You wouldn't get pulled toward a distant object because there's nothing between you and that object. But how's that force acting? That force is acting on you. Well, it's acting through a medium of some kind, and that's the fabric of space that gets warped, right? So how we perceive reality is very different. We have eyes that see in the visual spectrum. That's a very, very narrow spectrum. James Webb sees way out here, okay? And the other telescopes, like the X-ray telescope, Chandra, looks way out here, actually way out here. So it's in seeing the universe in light that we can't see in. So our perception is a tiny little narrow band called the visual spectrum, and everything we do tends to be hovering around that and what our eyes pick up and what our instruments can pick up out here and out here. But there's also more frequencies out there than we know. We can't go all the way into the deep infrared. James Webb would love to. It gets very far, but it can't. So our reality is skewed a little bit by our small window into the universe that we can actually really see into.
What do you think, Val? Do you think the issue is perception, or perhaps is it more how we view reality as a whole is the issue for negotiating the gap?
Well, I think it never ceases to amaze me how our individual perceptions of things, the three of us here, we are all experiencing this show very differently, and the people listening are experiencing it differently, and the people that watch it or listen to it later will experience it differently. How many times have you sat at the Thanksgiving table and you're talking about a memory of something you all did together, but Aunt Pat remembers it one way and Cousin Kathy remembers it another way and Grandpa remembers it another way, but we were all there at the same moment. How come we perceive things so differently? Because we all have filters and personal beliefs that may be very different from the other people. And, and there's so much coming at us all the time. I kind of think, more so now than when we were children, we're being inundated constantly with things from our cell phones, from advertisements on the side of the road, from cars, from radio. It's always, stuff is constantly bombarding us. And I think we're kind of trying to protect ourselves half the time and not see things. And so we have these blinders on, and then we miss things because we're trying so hard to not be overwhelmed with so much stuff that is coming at us. And then we miss possibilities, I think. I don't know if that answers your question at all.
I don't think there really is a sort of accurate answer to it. It's because it's true. I mean, we all view things differently, because effectively the problem of the unknown is the subject object problem, right? You know, we know there's an objective reality and there's a subjective person viewing it, and then there's a third party that's, you know, prior experience, depending on how you interpret it, that you know, filters how we perceive the objective reality. We know something's happening, but how it's interpreted is sort of the crux of it, which I think is important to note. But the reason I bring it up is one of the biggest things I personally have found over the last few years that's been very helpful. Because my dad, you know, was like, oh, multiversal awareness, all et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I always had an issue with, okay, well, you know, I know it's there, right? I know that there's something else going on, but how does one experience it? Well, you're always experiencing it, but okay, but how do I understand it? And I always had a hard time wrapping my brain around it. I kind of understood it, and I didn't really think too much about it. I think that was the thing. But I kind of did a little bit of research into, you know, sort of phenomenology, which is sort of the study of human experience. And there was a really fascinating... he's still alive. He's this philosopher in Canada named Charles Taylor, and he has this really interesting theory that, you know, I've brought this up several times. Again, apologize. I just find it very important that there are sort of two versions of how we as humans have viewed the self over the last, you know, millennia, right? So there's sort of the modern buffered self, where, you know, we put a buffer between us and the world around us, where we step back and we kind of analyze and pick it apart, and we separate ourselves from the world in a sense. And then there's the porous self, which is sort of the pre-modern way in which, you know, we view the world, where the border between oneself and the world is sort of fluid, and how one participates in the world is very fluid, as opposed to like, I'm going to step back and really analyze this. It's more of a, you know, it's more of a give and take with the world around us. And I bring that up because I've really been into ancient mythologies and how, you know, they viewed the world, because it's like, okay, well, they didn't know the color blue existed until 2,000 years ago. So, I mean, you know, their experience of reality must have been incredibly different. I mean, Homer referred to the Mediterranean as the Great Burgundy Sea. So it's like, you know, what else were they experiencing differently? Because I think we have this idea that, you know, oh, well, they're like us, but they don't have iPhones. And I think that that's sort of a misnomer, because they thought of things very differently. And it's very obvious they thought of things differently, because look at their infrastructures, right? They lasted forever. And meanwhile, we can't build a road that lasts more than 50 years. It's how they viewed the world around them was very different. Not even in just, you know, mundane senses. There was a sort of sense that there were sort of these overlapping layers of reality that were constantly going on, and there was no separation between the political, the mythological, the mundane, you know, the spiritual. It was all there. It was all in one sort of package. You know, when they revered the emperor as a god, you know, it wasn't like, oh, well, you know, he's just a really powerful guy. That was part of it. But, you know, being godlike was exerting your will on the world, which is like a godlike thing. You know, Julius Caesar wasn't hailed as a god because he was a good guy. He was hailed as a god because he, you know, killed 6 million Gauls and enslaved 6 million more. You know, it's this whole idea, and we still do the same thing today. We don't know it. We don't call it that. You know, idolizing someone, right? You know, we look at the root of the word, idol. You know, we have people that do that today. You know, your Jeff Bezos's, your Elon Musk's. We do the same thing. You know, we have different words for it, but the story, the human story, doesn't change. You know, it's all the same stuff over and over and over and over again. You know, hence why, here's my point. We have all of these things: UFOs, Mothmans, Bigfoots, you know, your upright canine cryptids. We change the words around, but it's all the same stuff. You know, you go to like Latvia or like deepest, darkest Romania, vampires and werewolves are very much a thing. You know, you talk to anybody out there, they're like, oh yeah, that's a real thing, and that's just what it is. It's a part of daily life, and it's the same thing. If you go to deepest, darkest India, they're like, oh yeah, Hanuman. Yep, that's a thing. Yeah, it is what it is. But for whatever reason, here in the Western world, we just can't we can't wrap our minds around it. We're like, we have to figure it out. There's got to be some explanation. And you know what? I think the thing is, yeah, sure, there might be science behind it. There probably is. And we just haven't figured it out yet. But the thing that I can't get past is these things haven't changed. They've been here forever. They've been with us forever. That's the big thing. And for everyone's treating it like it's new, and it's not. Just because a symbol of a thing is a symbol doesn't mean it's not a thing.
And that goes to my concept that I said before, and that was that, if it's happening all over the place, you have to consider that maybe there's some reality behind it, even if it's a distorted reality, right? But you still want to get to the bottom of it.
Exactly. And I think the first thing is understanding how we experience it before we even get anywhere else. Because, it's like, I don't think we have time to get into how we interpret knowledge, but, it's important, right? There's a difference between collecting empirical data and then having to interpret it. It's two different ways of viewing it. As the Greeks called, you had doxa, which is the knowledge of public opinion, and then episteme, which is the knowledge of science. And they differentiated the two. Because it's like, yeah, sure, you can get data and numbers, but you still have to interpret it. Which would be science of public opinion. So here we are. And I think it's important that we understand ourselves first before we can even get into understanding the unknown. And I think that's the part that we don't know.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Well said, Ben.
Thank you. I think a lot about this, probably too much. And and on that note about thinking about a lot of things, we can hop into our announcements here. So over the next few months or so, we've had to kind of push it off to the new year. My dad and I will be working with Reverend Michael Carter of Ancient Aliens on a very special podcast with new information that he's uncovered on the Ancient Aliens theme, which he has been on Ancient Aliens many, many times. He's a wonderful man. And we had him on for the Western Connecticut UFO conference hosted by the Danbury Public Library a couple of weeks ago. And that was a wonderful time, and we'll be doing some work with him. You can check out the full video when we eventually post it at our Behind the Paranormal YouTube channel, and there will be more information to come on that.
All right. Visit our show website, behindtheparanormal.com, where you can find nearly 1,200 hours of regular shows and special broadcasts since 2008 from CBS Radio, Achieve Radio, and here on WOON AM and FM. Also, hear many of these broadcasts on the major podcast platforms, including iTunes, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube.
And Ben, I'm curious what you're doing next week.
Well, we'll get there eventually, because my dad forgot to put in the part about our charity page, because we have a charity page on our website that they're all charities that we've vetted, that we know, that we've been working with for a long time, that we really like to have with us and mention, because you know what? What's the point of having a platform if you can't try and do something and give back with it? You can always check out the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation of America. That's on there. The Sisterhood of Ground Zero. There's also Hope for Hilldale Cemetery, which is run by our good friend Tom Spitaleri, and a whole bunch of other charities on there as well. And you can also find our books on there, behindtheparanormal.com. You can also check out Amazon as well. You can find all the books my dad and I have written over the years, including the things that he has written without me, which are a plethora. And there's all sorts of interesting things. And eventually, hopefully, we will be working on our next book, which Valerie is a part of as well. So we'll get there when we get there, I suppose. And next week, geez, we're already plowing through November, and we're going to be in December. So December 3rd, we're going to have British researcher Mark Ollie on with us to talk about UFO crash debris, and perhaps we should call it UAP crash debris, and then we can have a nice little rhyme in there. And then Tim Schwartz will also be with us to co-host, and he's a really great guy. I like working with him a lot. So Valerie, do you have a quote for us?
I do. We will leave you today with a thought from Albert Einstein. There are only two ways to live your life. One is as though nothing is a miracle. The other is as though everything is a miracle.
Very nice.
Thank you. And I'm Valerie LaFaso.
And well done, Val. And it was enjoyable to be here. I'm Mark D'Antonio.
And I'm Ben Eno. And thanks for joining us on our great cosmic
Return
journey.
to this radio frequency 167 hours from now for another edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.